So how this tutorial works is we're going to look at sharpening a chisel, and then we're going to take the principles from that and see how that applies to other edge tools. So we start with a chisel, and when you take that out of the box, you'll see that it's got 2 angles on it, or it should have. If it's brand new, it might only have 1 angle on. Once you've finished preparing this for work, it's going to have 2 angles on. You've got a grinding angle and a honing angle. And if I show you on the board here, an enlarged chisel, as it's delivered to you, it will have an angle of 25 degrees. That's your ground angle, and that's already on the chisel ready for you as it comes from the factory. Eventually, that ground angle will have to be put back on, but we're not going to deal with that today. It'll be quite a few weeks, months, perhaps even years before you need to worry about that. So we're going to concentrate on this angle right at the tip of the chisel, which is slightly different, and that's at 30 degrees. That's the honed angle. That's the angle that you're going to put on, that I'm going to show you how to put on now. So in order to put the angle on your chisel, or your plane or whatever, you're going to need an oil stone or a water stone or a diamond stone. We've got an oil stone here, and oil that we need to lubricate the process. And this is ordinary household 3-in-1 oil, watered down, well not watered down, diluted with white spirit. So it's about 50% oil, 50% white spirit, and you can see, I don't know if you can see that, but it's a little bit thinner than normal oil. A bit thicker than WD-40, a bit thinner than 3-in-1 oil. That's about the consistency that you're looking for. It's an art, not a science, but I find it easier to work with a plastic container because I can screw the top off and thin down the oil. And this is my stone. This is what I work with. It's a combination stone, so it's got a fine side and a coarse side. If you need to do any heavy work, you start with the coarse side. For day-to-day use, just putting a honed edge back on your chisels, just as part of the day-to-day usage, the fine side should be ample. So that's an oil stone. However, the demonstration that I'm going to do, I'm going to use these diamond stones. A couple of reasons for that. One is this is what you'll probably be using in college. This is what we have in our workshops. And the other reason is that it's a little bit cleaner. Working with these is less likely to cause problems like dermatitis even after prolonged use, because the lubricant for this is just water. That's just ordinary water in a household sprayer. And again, we've got 2 grades. We've got a coarse and a fine diamond stone here as well. For most purposes, there's not much difference between the two, so either would probably do. We're doing a little bit of light honing on this chisel, so we're going to use the fine stone. And the first thing we're going to do is spritz it. Just give it a little spray with our water bottle. And the first thing that we're going to do is put the back of the chisel perfectly flat on the diamond stone. Hold it perfectly flat. It's got to be absolutely flat. And we're going to flat that back edge. Just sort of rubbing it in a circular motion on here. And as long as you do this regularly, you shouldn't have to work for very long to get a good edge. There's various ways of doing this, different techniques, different orders that people use, all sorts of different stones. And I would suggest that you just start with something nice and simple. This is a simple technique, simple, relatively cheap diamond stone to work with. Don't get bamboozled with all the options of water stones and very, very fancy and expensive techniques and tools for sharpening your chisels until you're sure that you need to go that far. So this is a good starting point. So we should by now have a perfectly flat back to this chisel, and we can tell whether we have. The shiny edge that I've just put on should reach all the way across that back edge, the front of that back edge of the chisel. So if I get something to point with, if you look all the way along that cutting edge, I should be able to see a shiny line consistent all the way across. That shows me that I've got a completely flat edge right across the back. Okay, the next thing that I do is I need to work on the front. And this is where it gets a little bit trickier. So we need to put put the chisel on the stone and just feel where that ground edge is. So we feel it sitting comfortably on that ground edge, and then we just lift it up a little bit. You've got to imagine 5 degrees. We're not going to measure it, we don't use a protractor. Most people can pretty much feel that. So it's just like that, and then up that little bit. And if we're not doing too much work, we should just be able to go with 2 or 3 backstrokes. We should be able to feel a burr all the way across that back edge. So by stroking the chisel on that angle, just lifted it up from that 25-degree angle onto the 30-degree angle, we should be able to create a burr all the way across there, and I've got that, and I've done that in maybe 5 or 6 passes. So now what we have is a chisel that looks like this, but it's got a little burr here. That's where the metal, as we've rubbed along here, a little bit of the metal's rubbed over and it creates a little bit of a wire edge or a burr. We've got to take that burr off because that's going to get in the way, obviously, of our bits of wood if we want to chop into that bit of wood. So very, very gently back onto the back of the chisel and just a really, really gentle stroke that way. And we should feel that burr's gone. Should be able to feel that it's gone. Unfortunately, rather than being gone completely, what it does is it goes onto that edge. So if you now feel there, you'll feel that burr's come back. When you do this yourself, you'll feel that. So really, really gently, just stroke it back that way. And you do that a few times till you can't feel the burr either on the front or the back. Obviously, you don't press on hard. It wants to get lighter and lighter on a fine stone until that burr's completely gone. If you press on hard, all you'll do is just keep creating a new burr on either side again and again. So that burr should be pretty much gone now. Clean the stone, clean the chisel, sorry. And the last thing that we need to do to remove any microscopic little bit of a wire edge is we strop. And I use my hand. I've got fairly coarse hands. I'm used to doing this all the time, and I can strop my chisel like that. And I've done this for years and years without a problem. It looks as though it ought to give you a cut, and it doesn't. So as you get more confident, that's a sort of traditional stropping stance. You see carpenters for hundreds of years doing that with their sort of leathery hands. If you're not confident to do that, and don't do it if you think you might cut yourself, what you need is a piece of leather, like a barber's strop, an old belt, anything like that will do, and you do the same sort of process on the piece of leather. Another thing that people do is use a piece of hardwood. This has got, use this, not the bench on it, because a lot of people, you can see cuts all along the front of this bench where people have done this to the bench. Don't do it to your bench, respect your bench. You can get a piece of hardwood and just do a knife cut like that through, and that also helps to remove that little bit of a wire edge. So that should be sharp enough to shave with by now, and it will be. It'll certainly be really, really good for chopping out our mortises or whatever we're doing. If the chisel has had more than light use, if there's knocks in it, if you've hit a screw or a nail or anything, then you have to do a little bit more work. There's a slightly different technique. Again, you start by flattening the back of the chisel, and then you might have to do a little bit more work on the honed angle. And the way to do that, if you're doing a lot, if you're going to be going for a while, rather than just straight backwards and forwards, is you try and get used to working in a figure of 8. It's a nice, easy motion, especially if you're using a water stone or an oil stone. It spreads the wear all over your stone. And the movement actually makes it easier, rather than just going straight backwards and forwards. Once you get used to doing it this way, it makes it easier to keep your chisel flat. Well, I find that it does anyway. So that figure of 8 motion, you can work away for 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes if it's quite badly damaged. And again, then you go through the process of removing that wire edge. So by that time, you should have a really, really sharp chisel. It should be able to cut paper. You should be able to shave with it if you've done it right. So we're going to look at sharpening and setting a pretty standard bench plane. This is a Stanley jack plane. It's come straight out of the box. It's the sort of thing that you want to be buying as your first plane. It's going to cost around about £60. It's good quality steel. and it's an ideal plane for the beginner. It's called the jack plane because it's the jack of all trades. It'll do a little bit of jointing, it'll take the place of much longer planes. You can use it instead of a smoothing plane. Until you build up a full kit of planes, it's a good starting point because it'll cover most jobs. So as it comes out of the box, it's not quite ready to use. A couple of things that you need to do. First of all, you take it apart. You take off the lever cap, which is this. See how we did that? Up, lift the lever up. You shouldn't have to adjust that screw at all. Take the lever off, and it's on a keyhole slot, and that comes off. Then you take off the cap iron and the iron ore blade. You need to separate those two. So use the lever cap as a screwdriver and just undo that screw half a turn, and then that'll come out of there like that. That's what does all the cutting. This lever cap strengthens the blade, it adds rigidity to the blade, acts as a chip breaker because it sits on the blade like so and sends the shavings off from the blade, prevents chatter just by stiffening things up at that end. And it needs to sit very, very flat on the top of the blade like that. So the first thing you do when you get this out of the box is you just make sure that this edge that sits on top of the iron is nice and flat. And we do that by using our diamond stone or oil stone, putting our lever cap on it like so, and just rubbing it to and fro until that edge is nice and flat and you can see that it's shiny all the way along. Just spritz that a little bit, it's running a bit dry. We make sure that's perfectly flat all the way across. Once that's got a new shiny line all the way across, we know that's pretty flat. There are further techniques that we can have a look at when we get into slightly more advanced tuning of a plane, but just for now, that should mean that that's going to sit perfectly flat on top of the iron, and what you won't get wood shavings getting stuck between the two, which is really frustrating. That'll slow you down no end. So that's first operation. The next thing we do is we get a screwdriver and we make sure that these two screws are nice and tight. So this is the frog, and it needs to sit very firmly on the main body of the plane, and it needs to be nice and parallel in here with the mouth of the plane. So it might need a little bit of adjusting. I'm just going to undo those, set them back about 5 or 6 millimeters from the back of the mouth and nice and parallel. So this unit here, this casting, is nice and secure and it's parallel. The front of it is nice and parallel with the mouth of the plane. Just really squeeze those up. Okay. Everything else for now should be okay. There are ways, again, there are things that we can do with this plane to make it work really, really well. Fine tuning, but let's get the thing working. Let's get it cutting a pretty good shaving in softwood, and then in a later tutorial or in the workshops we can talk about how we go a little bit further to get the very best out of it. Okay. So the next thing we're going to look at is our blade or iron, and just like the chisel that we talked about earlier, as this comes out of the box, it's got a ground angle of 25 degrees, and we need to put our 30-degree honed angle on it, and we go through exactly the same process. The only thing that you might notice, this plain blade, obviously being a little bit wider, is pretty much as wide as our stone. A bigger plane, it might be even wider than the stone, so obviously just going backwards and forwards isn't going to be enough. So that's, again, where our figure of 8 action comes into play. It makes sure we get a nice, even, beveled angle across the front of our plane. So, again, like the chisel, we start off flat, make sure that's flat, shiny line all the way across the front, and then we put our beveled angle on the front. And it should be absolutely razor sharp. One other slight difference with our plain blade and our chisel blade, if I can draw this on the board, just get rid of our chisels. And we're looking at our blade this way on. So we're looking at the front of the blade, and unlike a chisel, which ideally for almost every application wants to be exactly square, our plane iron wants to have a slight camber on it. Two ways of doing this. The easiest way is to just, with practice and a rocking motion as you're sharpening and putting the angle on. So as you're doing your figure of 8, gradually you learn to put a little bit more, I'm going to really exaggerate here, a little bit more on that side as you go that way, a little bit more on that side as you go that way. Okay, we're talking about fractions of a millimetre here. This is a huge exaggeration just to illustrate what we're doing. So you're doing something like this, but it will be imperceptible to anyone watching you. You just feel that little bit more pressure that way and that way as you're doing your figure of 8. It sounds difficult to do, but with practice it's quite easy, it's quite natural. In fact, most people getting used to sharpening do that anyway. It's kind of hard to keep a wide blade perfectly flat, so you end up doing that by accident anyway. So that camber on your beveled angle, your honed angle, your 30 degrees, stops your plane digging in to the wood. Imagine you're planing down a piece of wood here. If it's perfectly square, it digs in here and you get what's known as tram lines. You'll get lines running down your wide boards, and you don't want that. So that slight camber takes that out. As you get into more advanced work, or you get in a little bit more advanced in your sharpening, you can, and this is better for a jack plane. That camber is really good for a smoothing plane. For a jack plane, as you develop your skill sharpening, you can learn to make it flat, but with a slight radius on either end. Just, I don't know if you can see that slight radius there like that. Again, which takes the tram lines out, but keeps a nice flat surface. That's a little bit advanced. Takes a little while to be able to do that. Your camber is a little bit easier. So start with that. Start by trying to put just a slight camber in it. When I mean slight, it's maybe 0.2 or 3 of a millimetre all the way across of camber. So having done all that, let's imagine that we've put everything together, that we've got everything sharp, we've got a flat edge here, we've got a nice 30-degree angle, a little bit of a camber on there. We put it back together. So slide the cap iron back onto your blade or iron, and the distance between the two at the front here needs to be anything from about 2 millimetres for softwood to 0.5 of a millimetre for hardwood, for dense timber. Put that together, tighten that up, and it needs to be really tight. So again, we use our cap iron as a screwdriver, or I do, always have done. Pop it back into the plane and clip your cap iron into place. That went a little bit too easy for me, so I'm just going to put a little bit, just 1/8 of a turn on that screw, just to make that cap iron engage a little bit more firmly. And that'll take the chatter out, it'll stop it bouncing across the timber if it's cutting really hard wood or difficult grain. Make sure everything lines up nicely. And then we've got some adjustment. We've got lateral adjustment here, and we've got depth adjustment here. And what we need to do is hold our plane up to a source of light or a very white wall and just adjust the depth until you can just barely see the plane sticking out of the mouth here, and make sure that it's perfectly parallel with the mouth. So again, holding things up to a nice source of light, you can move your lateral adjustment lever to make sure it's perfectly flat. So it should be sticking out just a fraction, nice and flat, nice and parallel to the face, to the bottom of the plane, and then you should be ready to go. Try your plane out on a piece of wood to start with, on a piece of scrap wood, and make sure it's cutting right. You might want to do just some final adjustments, just suck it and see, just have a go, take a shaving off and see if it's where it needs to be. Sign of a good, well set up plane is you can take a very fine shaving. So something that you can do, a little competition if you like, is get your vernier gauge and see how fine a shaving you can take off in a given piece of wood, and see if your mates can do any better. So as they get finer and finer and finer, you know you're doing your job well. So that's how to set up and sharpen a fairly typical bench plane. It's the start of how to do it. There's a lot of advanced techniques. Don't get overwhelmed, don't set your bar too high. Get good at doing that, what I've just shown you, and then you can do your own research or talk to me in the workshops and we can develop more deeper skills. So one little point to remember, one final point, is there are different types of plane, all sorts of different types of plane, but they fall into two main categories. There's bevel up and bevel down. This is a traditional European style bevel down plane, and that means that our beveled angle in our plane, if this is our plane, the bevel that we put in goes downwards. It points to the bottom of the plane, and then we've got our cap iron on there to hold everything in place. There's a different type of plane that's getting quite popular now, like this. It's a bevel up plane. It works in a slightly different way. So if I take that blade out, you can see there's no cap iron. You can see that the iron itself, the blade, is much, much thicker, and the bevel that we've just put on, the ground angle and the honed angle, is pointing upwards rather than down. Because it's so thick and because that bevel's going upwards rather than downwards, it doesn't need a cap iron. They're very good. A lot of people really like these planes. There's all sorts of debates as to the relative values of each plane. One thing I will say is these are very expensive, so you want to be sure that you want to make that sort of investment before you buy one of these planes. On the whole, with certain variations, the sharpening technique is the same. As this plane is set up for general work, the angles are the same, the technique is the same. So we start off flat, we turn it over and do our beveled angle, and then we put everything together. And really the adjustment, depth adjustment and side-to-side adjustment, is pretty much self-evident. The best way of having a go at one of these, learning how to use one of these, is have a go. Okay, so that's a bevel up plane, bevel down plane. Let's have a look at some other examples. We've got another bevel up, Spokeshave is bevel down, that one. Our block plane is bevel up, and the shoulder plane is bevel up. Techniques are the same. Don't worry too much about the technique. And basically, if you're taking one of these apart, note how it comes apart and see if you can put it back together. If you're struggling, you can always ask one of your tutors. So this is a Spokeshave. It's something that traditional woodworkers use quite a lot. It's intended for curved work. Spokeshave comes from originally shaving spokes. It was wheelwrights that probably invented these and developed them. We use them for any sorts of curved work. There are different types, there are different ways of using them. That's not what we're here to talk about today. I'm just going to show you how to sharpen one. We'll talk about how to actually use them in the workshop or in different tutorials. So, this one has a knurled nut here and a keyhole slot similar to the lever cap on your traditional bench plane, on your normal bench plane. And it's got a very small blade in there. The angles and sharpening technique are the same. So we just spritz the stone and polish the back. Make sure that back's nice and sharp. So there's all sorts of jigs and tools you can buy to sharpen these. I like to do things by hand if I can. Jigs have their place, but you can spend an awful lot of money on things that you don't get a lot of use out of. There's a really, really easy way to sharpen this without any expensive or complicated jigs. And you need a screwdriver, and you're using the slot that's a natural part of its construction anyway. So we've got the back flat. We just need to put our honing bevel on, a honing angle. So if you put your chisel through there, it extends everything. I can keep everything nice and straight with my fingers, but I've got leverage and I've got control based on my, my screwdriver. I did call it a chisel, didn't I? It's a screwdriver through there. Find your ground angle, lift it up 5 degrees, and then your nice, easy figure 8 motion. And ideally, as you get used to this, you just roll it a little bit to put that slight camber on. These work well for me when they have just that slight camber, the same as we talked about with the that's ideal for a smoothing plane or a jack plane. So we do that. make sure our burr's all the way across, and then remove the burr as we would with a chisel or a plane iron. So to sharpen a gouge, which basically needs the same angles and bevels as a plane or a chisel, we need to use a slightly different technique. It's not, it's basically the same angle that we're trying to put on, but obviously because that isn't flat, if we just sort of rub away, we're going to end up with a flat edge. We're going to lose that curve. So we need to maintain the curve of this gouge as we sharpen. So again, this is where getting into the habit of using a figure of 8 motion comes in handy, because it's absolutely essential for how we sharpen a gouge. I'm going to do this in slow motion. Imagine this speeded up as to what it would look like, and then I'll speed up as I go along. So we find our ground angle, lift it up just that little bit to give us another 5 degrees to get our 30-degree sharpening angle, our honing angle. And then we turn the gouge as we do our figure of 8 motion. So we get an even honing action over the full cutting edge of the gouge. And this does take a little bit of practice. Just make sure that that burr that you're making is going all the way along, which it is. And as soon as you've got a burr, you don't want to do too much of that. As soon as you've got a burr, what you need to do is get a slipstone, which I've got here. I keep these soaking in white spirits. A nice fine slipstone, which you can see has got a radius on it that will fit inside the radius of the gouge. And we just take that wire edge off. Make sure that wire edge is gone. And then really, really gently remove our wire edge from the front side, from the back side, and then you can just do your final tuning like this. Try and get that nice and sharp. And then just for your final stropping, what you need is a thin bit of leather, and you can pop that in the vise, something like a belt, an old piece of belt. Pop that in the vise, double it over and pop it in the vise so that it looks something like this. If you imagine that's the jaws of the vise, you've got a piece of leather looking like that, and you can use that to strop your gouge. So this handy tool is a cabinet scraper. I made this one about 20 years ago out of a piece of old source steel, and it's basically just a flat square piece of steel that we use for fine scraping of hardwoods to get a really, really good finish. You'll find it really, really useful. Lots of people use them. They're quite difficult to sharpen, so I'll just take you through the sharpening techniques. The principle that this works on is that it has a burr, and we've already talked about burrs that we create without wanting to when we're sharpening up chisels and plane irons. This has a burr all the way around, and we actually use that to as a cutting edge. And if I show you on the blackboard, we're looking this way on. In use, it's going to look something like that. So it's got a rounded edge here and a couple of burrs, and that's what creates the shavings. As it wears, this burr starts to get rounded and it's no longer any use. So what we have to do is take that burr off completely, consolidate our edge, make it square, and then create a new burr. And this is how we do it. So I'm using my oil stone now. Doesn't matter, we could do this on a diamond stone or an oil stone. Little drop of oil. On the fine side, I'm going to take off the old burr just by rubbing that completely flat, all around all the edges. I'll I'll do that until I can't feel an edge at all. One thing that you'll notice if you're using oil stones instead of water stones is it is much, much dirtier. So you do need to keep washing your hands, keep putting the barrier cream on and keep a rag handy. So having done that, probably take a little bit longer than that. Just for the sake of time, I'll show you the principles. When you can feel that there's no burr all the way around, you're ready for the next process. So we need to get our edge nice and square. So we drop that in the vise. And we need an engineer's file, nice fine file, and you need to hold it completely square as you straighten that edge. Now years ago, I made myself a little jig. Out of hardwood with a sliding wedge in there. So I drop that in there, push that wedge across, and then I've got something to hold this file nice and square as I flatten that edge. So I take that all the way around, flatten the edge as I go, and when I've done that, using the file in its normal direction of use, I put the handle back on, which is really important. If you leave the handle off, that can cause a nasty injury as you find it gets stuck in the palm of your hand really easily, surprisingly easy to do that. So handle back on, and then I draw file. So holding the plane nice and flat. Watch the edges. You don't want to round the edges off and it's easy to fall off the edge of what you're doing. I get a really smooth, square, solid edge all the way around by draw filing. So again, they'll go all the way around the scraper doing that. Having done that, what we have is a burr. We've created a burr, but it's very weak. It's not strong enough to do the job that we want it to do. So that burr that we've generated with the file, we're just going to take that off again. So all the way around, make that nice and flat. On all the edges. So finally, before we start putting the burr on, we need to hold this nice and straight up and down on our oil stone and just finely polish that edge. So we've gone from filing to draw filing to honing. So we've got a really, really smooth edge, and that's essential to the working of this tool when we're actually using this cabinet scraper and using that burr as a cutting edge. So having done that, we can see we've got a nice clean edge all the way around. Now we put our burr on. So we put all the sharpening and honing tools to one side. Pop this back in the vise, and what you need next is a really hard piece of steel, hard piece of smooth steel. You can actually buy a piece of round steel that's very, very hard, specifically for this purpose, specifically to put the burr back onto your cabinet scraper. One of the things I love about cabinet scrapers is that they're very cheap. It's a nice natural use of old source steel. And by the same token, I've just got an old saw file, and I've ground a flat edge here, just the last 40, 50 millimeters of that. Hasn't got any teeth on it, it's just ground nice and flat. And that's what I use because it's free, it was just recycling. So what I do now is I take that nice flat edge that's been sharpened and honed, and I run my hard steel along the top of it, which further consolidates the edge, just makes it nice and dense and compact. I'm going to come around this way, and I'm going to hold this at an angle. Okay, so it's flat there. Now I drop it down by about 5 or 6 degrees, and really push down hard. So you can see I'm bending that cabinet scraper as I do this. Watch the ends that you don't hurt yourself as you get to the end. And I'm pushing it down hard at that slight angle to start to create this burr. So what we've got is that hardened steel is starting to shove the edge of that cabinet scraper over there. So we've got the start of a burr. You do that once, increase your angle slightly, and then do it again. So you're pushing down hard. And by now I should have a really nice sharp burr at about the right angle to create that cutting edge. So you've got like a miniature plane, really. You do that all the way round, all sides, so you've got 8 good cutting edges, and that'll last you all day on most timbers.